He had barely stepped off the bus, barely had time to drop his backpack, when he saw his 6-year-old daughter being dragged across the yard like a piece of trash by her grandmother. Why would a grandmother do that to her own granddaughter? And what had made an entire town cry over a father's silence? Stay with me until the end of this story to discover what changed the way an entire town saw things and why a silent father was the only one who dared to bring justice for his daughter. What do you believe truly makes a home? Did you come back to get your daughter or to face a guilt that was never really yours? That question kept circling in Daniel Harper's mind from the moment he stepped off the bus. No one recognized him. With his hair cut military short, a uniform faded from years of wear, and a heavy backpack slung over his shoulder, he looked more like a stranger than someone who had once been born there. 4 years on the northern border had stripped him of too much: his youth, his rest, and the only woman he had ever loved. He had no real plan other than returning to the place he once called home. But a letter from a neighbor, just a few lines smudged with ink, changed everything. "The girl's not okay. That woman beats her very badly." That was enough for Daniel to leave everything behind and abandon his post earlier than expected. On a gray morning, he boarded a bus without telling anyone. He had barely taken a few steps from the terminal when he heard shouting at the far end of the street. "You little brat! You killed your mother, and now you want to keep living off of me." The screams tore through the air as if choking the entire neighborhood. No one stepped in, but no one left either. They just stood there watching. Some out of curiosity, some shaking their heads, and a few frowning as if they'd grown used to the scene. A girl maybe 6 years old was being dragged out of a house. Her hair was tangled, her clothes wrinkled. A bony old woman was yanking her by a braid with fury, as if venting her anger on something without a soul. Daniel stopped. His heart clenched. Even without seeing her face clearly, the small figure, the way she pressed her lips together to bear the pain, it was exactly like the girl in the wrinkled photo he carried over his heart. "I'm hungry. I'm sorry. I can take it, I swear," the girl whispered so softly that only someone standing very close could hear. No one moved. The entire block stood frozen. A middle-aged man turned and walked into his house, hoping to avoid trouble. A fruit vendor watched, then lowered her eyes to gather the fallen bags on the sidewalk. Daniel stepped forward, not in a rush, not hesitating, just because his legs refused to stay still a second longer. He didn't say a word. He simply reached out and moved aside the old woman's bony arm that was pulling the child. The woman flinched when she saw him. What are you doing back? You're not part of this house anymore. I've raised her for 6 years. She's a curse, a demon child who killed my daughter." "She's my daughter," Daniel said, his voice hoarse like it had been scraped from a chest that had heard too many explosions. He crouched down and lifted the little girl. Her tiny body weighed nothing in his arms. She was limp, her eyes half open but unconscious. There was no surprise, no joy, only a numb emptiness. "Daddy," she whispered, as faint as a falling leaf. Daniel didn't look back. He held Lily against his chest and walked away slowly under the watchful gaze of every neighbor. No one stopped him. An elderly woman murmured, "She looks just like her mother did when she was little." Daniel heard her but didn't respond. Not because he didn't care, but because he had a stone lodged in his throat. The room where he was staying was a cramped attic behind the market, barely enough space for an old mattress. The owner, Mrs. Helen Granger, barely lifted her eyes before unlocking the door for him, maybe because she saw the unconscious child in his arms. Daniel laid Lily down, took off her worn-out shoes, and covered her with his jacket. She didn't wake, but her breathing was steady. Each breath was short but consistent, like her body knew it had to survive, not live. Daniel sat beside her and placed a hand on her forehead. It was cold. His hand, hardened by years of military training, trembled slightly. For the first time in years, he felt helpless. "You don't have to carry anything anymore. I'm here now." He said it softly, like a promise, but also like a confession. The photo he had in his pocket fell to the floor as he leaned forward. In the picture, Lily was laughing next to her mother. A child's smile, one that still didn't know the world would someday see her as a burden. Daniel picked up the photo and set it next to her. He knew it would be a long time before he saw that smile again. But at least from that moment on, no one would pull her hair again. No one else would call her a curse. Outside the window, the city sounds ticked by, like a broken metronome street vendors' carts. Distant church bells, hoarse voices calling out their goods. Life moved on as always. But in that small room, a father watched over his daughter, and a little girl slept for the first time without curling up in fear. Lily sat up abruptly, her eyes wide open, filled with panic. She covered her mouth as if trying to hold her breath, then looked around with confusion. Gray brick walls, a low ceiling, a strange smell in the air. Nothing looked like the old kitchen she used to sleep in. The unfamiliarity wrapped around her like a rope tightening across her chest. She didn't know where she was, why she was there, or whether someone would burst in yelling or grab her arm like so many times before. As her foot touched the cold floor, Lily shivered. Her eyes scanned the room and stopped on the emptiness. Her worn-out bag and the old coat her grandmother used to throw at her every time she was kicked out of the house weren't there. She ran to the door, her little hands desperately trying to turn the knob as if a monster were waiting on the other side ready to catch her. Daniel stood frozen in the middle of the small room, still holding a cup of warm milk. He set it down on the table and rushed toward the girl. "Sweetheart." He barely got a word out before Lily turned to face him, clutching her chest, stammering, "I didn't take anything. I'm sorry. I didn't steal anything. Please don't hit me. Please don't hit me." Her voice cracked into pieces, as fragile as a whisper after a long fever. Her whole body curled up, trembling, as if in that instant all the pain in the world poured out of her. Daniel stood frozen, his hand still reaching out now, with no reason to extend it. In front of him was not a frightened child, but a memory stolen by years of separation. A silence so long it had made even the strongest bond feel foreign. A soldier can cross trenches, dodge grenades and bullets, but that doesn't mean he knows how to reach the daughter he once held in his arms. He slowly stepped back as if afraid of startling a wounded bird. "It's okay. You didn't do anything wrong." Lily didn't respond. She stepped back further, pressing against the wall. Only when Daniel stopped moving toward her did she slowly collapse into a corner, covering her face with both hands. Daniel stepped outside. He didn't say a word to anyone, just walked with his head down. When he returned, his pocket bulged with a small carton of milk and a few sweet rolls hurriedly bought from the corner store. In the room, Lily was still curled up in the same corner. Her eyes were no longer blank, but veiled by a shadow like dust over an old memory. She looked up at the light coming through the wooden window, her lips barely moving as if trying to say something already buried deep in her mind. But no one else heard. Daniel didn't say anything more. He placed the milk on the table, dragged a chair toward her, but left enough space so she wouldn't feel trapped. "If you like it, I can get more. You don't have to ask. If you want it, that's enough." There was no answer, but Lily glanced at him from the side. It was a round look full of confusion and doubt. As night fell, the room's only lamp cast the shadow of the two of them on the wall. Lily had eaten half the roll, sipped some milk, but hadn't said a word. Daniel opened his backpack and took out an old photograph, its edges curled and yellowed like paper dried by the sun. In the picture, a young woman held a sleeping newborn. Her face was gentle, her hair a little messy, and her smile sweet but tired. Lily was so small, wrapped in a blanket, her tiny hands gripping the collar of her mother's blouse, as if letting go would mean losing her forever. Daniel placed the photo on the table and gently pushed it toward Lily. She stared at it cautiously. "That's your mom. The day you were born. I took this picture at the hospital." Lily stared at the image for a long time. Then she reached out and gently touched the baby's figure with one finger. She didn't ask anything else. Daniel pulled an old book from his backpack. It was a fairy tale Lucia, Lily's mother, used to love reading. His voice was low and steady, never raising in tone. "Once upon a time, there was a girl named Marisol." Lily laid on her side, eyes wide open, motionless, as if clinging to a ray of invisible light in the air. The damp stains on the wall no longer scared her as much, but they still weren't enough to calm her. Instead of curling up in a corner like she did when she first arrived, she lay straight, hands over the blanket, fingers trembling, as if silently counting time. When Daniel closed the book, Lily wasn't asleep yet. But she didn't say anything either, only pulled the blanket up to her nose. A soft knock at the door made Daniel get up. It was Mrs. Edna Foster, holding a paper bag in her arms. "I brought some fruit and a few pastries we had left over today." Daniel thanked her gently, steering her away from looking too long at Lily, but Mrs. Foster leaned slightly. She placed the bag in front of the girl. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Lily looked up, then turned to Daniel. Her face looked like it wanted to disappear into the shadows. A moment later, she took a small step back. I don't have a name." Daniel turned away, biting his lip. Mrs. Foster didn't smile, nor did she step any closer. She simply tilted her head slightly, her gaze gentle and respectful. "The name can wait until tomorrow, but courage that can start tonight. You don't have to be anyone just yet. Just know you deserve to be called by a name that matters." She left without saying another word. Lily didn't move. But the photograph on the table was now just a little closer to the edge of the bed, just enough to know it wasn't by accident. A faint light began to filter through the crack in the whitewashed wall, like a thread of memory quietly slipping through the harshness of the present. That light landed right on the edge of Daniel Harper's jacket, the man who in silence was mending the sole of a shoe with thick thread and a curved, rusted needle. He squinted not just from the sun, but from every stitch pulling along heavy memories. A few steps away, Lily Harper was still in the same position she had been since waking up. She hugged her old teddy bear tightly. Its belly seemed split open like the cracks in her own heart. Her thin legs were tucked against the edge of the wooden bed, and her eyes were fixed on the slightly open door where a world waited that she still wasn't ready for. A deep, high-pitched engine roar echoed from far off like a call from another world breaking the thick silence of midday. It didn't sound like any vehicle that had ever traveled that dusty road. Daniel froze. The needle paused above the shoe sole he was stitching. A black Lamborghini, sleek and gleaming like a shadow moving backward through time, appeared at the edge of the dirt path, stopping with an arrogance that didn't belong in that place. The engine kept humming like the breath of a beast returning from a long journey. Daniel furrowed his brow and looked up. Lily didn't move either, but her eyes were no longer fixed on the door. Through the thin wooden boards, they both tried to make sense of the sound, as if it carried a piece of their history they hadn't yet discovered. The car door opened. A tall man stepped out, his walk firm, but measured like every step was retracing old ground from a life long past. Daniel squinted. He hadn't expected to see Mr. Raymond Ellis, his former trenchmate from those nights beneath flares and jungle sky. Raymond's polished shoes stopped at the doorway, and his rough voice, weathered by northern winds, cut through the air. "I'm looking for Mrs. Mullins. Does she still work the front desk?" Daniel stood up, slowly brushing dust from his worn jeans. He walked out with no rush, as if each step carried the weight of old memories. When their eyes met, time seemed to pause in that fragile moment of reunion. Raymond still stood tall, shoulders that had once withstood fire and fury. But now his gaze no longer held a commander's steel. It was softened ash layered over a deep fatigue, emotions held back in front of a soldier no longer in uniform. He wasn't just looking at Daniel, but at the younger man he once left behind. "Harper?" he asked in a low voice. Daniel gave a small nod. No handshakes, no greetings, just the quiet strength in how he stood enough to make Raymond grip the handle of his leather briefcase like trying to hold onto something he had barely touched. Mrs. Mullins appeared in the doorway, a kitchen towel in her hands. When she saw them, a faint smile crossed her face. It wasn't joy, but a silent acceptance that some reunions come without being summoned. "Raymond, I knew it was you. Come in, we have things to discuss." They sat at the wooden porch table. No one touched the mugs. Lily still hadn't stepped outside, but behind the cracked door, her eyes followed the scene with the tension of a string about to snap. Raymond didn't ask much. He listened about Claire Monroe's death, about Daniel's years on the northern border, about the late letter Mrs. Mullins had sent. When she spoke of how Lily's grandmother had thrown her out of the house, her voice dulled like an old confession. Raymond stayed silent, but his hands clasped tightly on his knees. "I know it's not always my place to get involved," he said, "but there's still a spare room at the True Haven Foundation and a backyard garden no one's touched in years. Maybe—" "I'm not here asking for shelter," Daniel interrupted gently. "I just need a place where my daughter can sleep for a few days. After that, we'll go." Raymond looked at him for a long moment. Finally, he turned to Mullins. "I owe you, not once but many times. This isn't a favor. It's how I make up for what I let slide." No more words were spoken. They weren't needed. Only the sound of a little girl's footsteps broke the stillness on the old wooden floor. Lily came out, Her eyes downcast, her teddy bear pressed tightly to her chest. She walked up to Daniel and tugged at his shirt. "Daddy, if they have warm water there, can I wash my hair?" Raymond looked away, holding back something rising in his eyes. Mullins pressed her lips together. Daniel crouched down and placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder. For the first time in days, she didn't flinch at his touch. A soft breeze swept through the doorway, carrying with it the scent of sunlit earth, not scorching heat, just the gentle warmth that pushes back shadows. Lily looked up at Raymond. She didn't ask anything, just looked. "Can I water the plants?" she asked quietly, like she was speaking to trembling leaves. Raymond nodded and stood up. "Let's go. The road to True Haven has some rough patches, but peace waits at the end." Daniel said nothing. He just looked at his daughter, then slung his backpack over his shoulder. In the eyes of a soldier who had lived alongside death, only one purpose remained: to make sure his daughter knew he would never abandon her again. Raymond's dusty red truck waited on the hill. When they climbed in, Lily was placed in the middle between the invisible arms of two men who shielded her without a word. She folded her thin hands on her knees, but for the first time in days, her gaze didn't dodge, didn't tremble. Through the dirty window, Lily watched the sun's rays stretch across dry fields and rusty tin rooftops like the wrinkled skin of old men. Sometimes she spotted figures standing in doorways, still as statues, staring into the same kind of emptiness she had once seen in her own reflection. They didn't speak for a long while, but the air inside the vehicle no longer felt heavy. It was more like a bridge one that didn't yet carry the name of hope, but where fear no longer held power. When they reached the base of the hill leading to the True Haven Foundation, Daniel glanced at the trees on either side. They had grown tall, their crowns forming a tunnel of cool shade. The leaves swayed gently in the breeze, casting a dance of light across the gravel path. Lily leaned forward slightly, still looking out the window. She murmured, "Daddy, do the birds really sing here?" Daniel smiled with a mix of tenderness and sadness. "Yes. Some of them have gotten so used to people they come close just to hear kind voices." Raymond watched them through the rearview mirror. He didn't say a word, but something stirred in his chest, because for the first time in years, he knew he had arrived on time. Not to save the world, but to hold together just one of them, a small, quiet one, the world of a little girl who once believed she wasn't worthy of love. There are debts that can't be paid with money, and there are wounds that don't heal with time, only with the decision to stay when every excuse says to leave. The wind chimes clinked softly, keeping a gentle rhythm like the whisper of an old house that had never known new footsteps. Beneath the vines draped over the eaves, Mrs. Mullins watched the girl who had just arrived, her expression fixed and thoughtful. The child clumsily took off her faded cloth shoes and set them quietly beside the front step. Her small face lifted and her eyes met the stern gaze of the housekeeper, though she couldn't hold it long. "What's your name?" asked Mullins, without kneeling, without softening her voice. "Lily." The girl whispered, her voice so faint it seemed to slip through the seams of her blouse. Mullins didn't reply. She just gave a slight nod, then turned around, leaving behind an instruction that landed with the cold weight of an order. "Clean clothes are in the bathroom. Change and come down to the kitchen. We don't wait around here." The guest room, now layered with a thin coat of dust from time, smelled of old wood mixed with the faint scent of soap from days long gone. Daniel silently placed his worn-out backpack on the table and ran his fingers along the edge of the neatly folded bedsheet as if it were part of a ritual too hard to name. When he turned around, he saw Lily still standing at the doorway, neither stepping in nor backing out, hugging her wrinkled teddy bear tightly. Her eyes focused on the doorframe, not directly on him, as if waiting for a magical sign that confirmed her presence in this place wasn't a mistake. The kitchen, once filled with aromas and laughter, now echoed with old familiar sounds, knives tapping on wood oil crackling as it hit the flame and hushed conversations carried between bursts of steam. But that day, the air paused every time someone passed nearby. The music of the kitchen was interrupted by caution, sideways glances, and whispers, not quite low enough for the newcomer to miss their absence of welcome. "They say the wife died during childbirth. That girl's so skinny, always looks lost. Doesn't seem like she's from a good family. Maybe the boss feels sorry for her because of what he's been through, but this ain't no charity." Daniel stepped in his footsteps, sounding like gravel under boots. He was used to judgmental looks, but it was hard to ignore how those stares passed through him without touching him like a ghost with weight. Mr. Raymond walked over to Lily and smiled warmly. "Did you know rosemary helps with memory?" Lily shook her head. He bent slightly and reached toward a low hedge, releasing its herbal scent. "People often confuse it with lavender, but if you smell it closely, you'll notice it's warmer, stronger. Touch a leaf and smell it." Lily hesitated, then gently brushed her fingers against a sprig. The strong scent stayed on her fingertips. She lifted her hand to her nose and, without meaning to, let out the faintest, most fragile smile. Daniel, standing behind her, didn't speak, but he saw how her shoulders relaxed just slightly, not as tight as they usually were when she entered an unfamiliar place. Upstairs, leaning against the window frame, Leandro raised his phone. "I think Grandpa's losing it. A crippled ex-soldier and that wild girl. He's letting emotions cloud his judgment." A barely audible voice responded on the other end. Leandro nodded, never taking his eyes off the two figures in the garden. "Get everything ready. We need a reason to shut this down before it turns into a burden for the family." That night, Mullins handed Lily a cotton dress covered in flowers. The fabric still carried the scent of softener. The girl took it with trembling hands. "What is it?" "Don't you like it?" "It's not that. It's just, my grandma used to say you're not allowed to wear pretty clothes unless you behave." Mullins stood still for a moment but didn't ask more. She simply knelt down to adjust the dress in her hands. Being beautiful doesn't depend on who gives you the clothes. It depends on how you care for them. If you keep it clean, you have every right to wear what you like. Darkness fell like a thick blanket, covering every corner and making the True Haven Foundation even more silent, almost to the point of suffocation. In the simple room, Lily curled up like a dry leaf, breathing slowly at times, other times in choppy rhythms from involuntary movements. Around midnight, her small body began to shiver, her legs drawing in the blanket, slipping toward the edge of the bed. A weak whimper escaped her dry lips. "I didn't take anything. I was just hungry. I didn't steal." Daniel was right beside her, gripping the small, trembling hand tightly. "It's over now, sweetheart. Daddy's here." Outside the window, the lavender branches swayed as if trying to return her to an interrupted dream, but the soft fragrance only seemed to stretch the uncertainty still hanging in the air. In a house accustomed to silence, the restless nightmares of a little girl brought with them questions no one dared to say out loud. Mullins, who had gone back to her room some time ago, still hadn't fallen asleep. Sitting by the nightstand lamp, she rested her face in one hand, staring into the dark. There are wounds that don't need blood to hurt. There are children who grow up not because they had everything, but because no one ever let them be small. Then she stood, opened the old armoire, and took out a faded silk handkerchief. She folded it slowly. Inside her, something had begun to move quietly, but in a way that couldn't be undone. Under that old wooden wardrobe at the end of the hallway where past guests used to stay lay a child's canvas shoe covered in dry mud. A fine layer of dust had started to settle on the tip, but the crease in the strap was still intact, like someone had left it there in a hurry, never looking back. Mrs. Mullins knelt, picked it up, gently turned it over in her hands, then placed it back exactly where it was. There are some things that, no matter how clean you make them, always feel out of place if they don't belong to you. Lily didn't ask why her father wasn't with her that day. She just clung to the wooden post on the porch, eyes fixed on the garden as if waiting for something familiar, or at least quiet, to appear. Daniel had left the True Haven Foundation early that morning with the same quiet instinct of someone used to battlefields, someone who doesn't want to wake anyone. In his pocket were a few names and addresses that his late wife Lucia had scribbled on a piece of paper years ago. Neighbors, acquaintances, colleagues. Not close, but not total strangers either. At a red-roofed house at the end of Laurel Street, an elderly doorman saw him approach and raised his eyebrows. "You're Lucia Rivas's husband, aren't you? I remember their wedding. I even chased their car down the street with a wooden fan I forgot to give her." Daniel nodded politely. The old man let him in, poured some water, and sat down in silence as if weighing something carefully. "We used to hear crying all the time," he said, eyes fixed on the table. "Sometimes late at night, sometimes at dawn, but no one dared step in." "Why?" Daniel asked quietly. "Because that house wasn't just any house. Miss Margarita, No one wants to cross her." Daniel didn't reply. He just looked out the window toward an old rocking chair that sat empty. In another part of the neighborhood, a woman who sold empanadas and had once been close to Lucia timidly handed him a roll. That little girl was so sweet, always kept a bit of distance from grown-ups. Every time someone offered her something, she'd ask, "Do I have to do something to deserve it?" I never knew what to say. No 6-year-old should know about those kinds of exchanges, let alone accept them as something normal. When Daniel returned to the True Haven Foundation, the sky was still hesitating between evening and a long, stretched-out afternoon. Lily was curled up on the front step, hugging her knees like they were the only coat she had. Her gaze drifted far off, though it wasn't clear whether she was deep in thought or simply giving in to forgetfulness. Mrs. Mullins was nearby, gently brushing dust off a few wilted lavender stems, not cutting them, just cleaning them with care. The whole yard seemed to hold its breath as if waiting for something to arrive. Daniel walked up so quietly that even the wind didn't stir. Lily didn't turn, but she murmured, "Last time I wet the blanket, my grandma made me sleep in the shed. There were rats and I got scared, but she said anyone who soils the bed doesn't deserve to be a person." Daniel sat down beside her. His hands clenched until they formed fists. "You'll never sleep alone again. Not anywhere," he said, his voice rough like each word scraped his throat. "I'm used to it," she answered. Her words fell like a dry leaf on cold stone. No one can imagine how heavy such a small response can be until a father hears it. Mrs. Mullins set the scissors down, brushed off her sleeves, and walked over. In her hands was a piece of brown cloth frayed at the edges but folded with care. "I used to hold this when I was little," she said softly. "My mom said it was the only thing that stopped me from crying when I was sick." She handed it to Lily. "It's not pretty, but it's real." Lily took it, brushed her fingers along the edge with hesitation, then hugged it to her chest like she couldn't believe it was really hers. Mrs. Mullins stepped back slowly, never taking her eyes off the girl. "She's never told a lie," she whispered. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was enough for Leandro Escobedo standing on the upstairs balcony to hear her. "And whose side are you on?" he asked, not angry, but clearly as a warning. Mullins looked at him. "I'm on the side of the one who doesn't have anyone on their side." Leandro didn't respond. He turned around, but the dry smirk on his lips didn't fade. That night, Lily carefully laid the piece of fabric over her pillow, brushing it gently as if trying to soothe something fragile. She said nothing, just closed her eyes slowly, still clutching it. Daniel stood in the doorway, not daring to enter, as if afraid to break the fragile piece that had just begun. He pulled a yellowed sheet of paper from his pocket so creased it felt like ash to the touch. It was the letter Lucia had written, but never sent. The handwriting was shaky, stained in places by long-dried tears. Every word was a whisper from the past reaching into his soul with all that had gone unsaid. "I'm not afraid of pain. I just fear that our daughter will grow up not knowing she's worth it. If I can't stay, please don't let Lily believe she was the reason for our loss." Daniel folded the letter. His hand still held the edge of the paper like he couldn't let it go. He placed it gently on the table and remained seated, watching the slow dance of shadows beyond the glass. The wind came in softly, carrying the scent of damp earth and leaves whispering in the dark. A dry twig brushed the window pane, making a sound almost human, like a call to what still hadn't been said. Not every child starts life on the right foot, but the blame is never theirs. When adults lack compassion, even silence can wilt a child's soul. But all it takes is one person with the courage to stay with the tenderness, to listen for hope to grow even in the deepest scars. The warmth from the oven spread evenly through the kitchen, where sunlight slipped through the old wooden window, casting pale stripes across the worn tiles. In that space, Mrs. Mullins stood with her back to everyone, carefully placing a lace doily on a round wooden tray. On top of it, 6 freshly baked rolls released gentle steam, golden and dusted with brown sugar like sunlight caught in grains. She didn't say a word. She just glanced toward the narrow gap in the door leading to the staircase. "Tell the girl to come down for breakfast," she said in a firm tone, neither harsh nor gentle, but with a seriousness that made the whole room fall briefly silent. The young assistant nodded shyly and left the kitchen. Everyone resumed their tasks, though their eyes kept drifting toward the tray of bread. When Lily appeared in the doorway, she looked like a lost soul. The slanted light highlighted her dry brown hair falling over small cheeks, and her dark eyes wide open as if afraid to touch anything she shouldn't. She stopped, not daring to fully step inside. No one called to her. No one pushed her. Mrs. Mullins simply nudged the tray a little closer to the edge of the table, then moved behind the girl without a sound. "You can eat," she said in a tone so neutral it wasn't clear whether it was a command or an invitation. Lily didn't move. She looked at the bread, then at Mullins with the face of someone who had just been caught doing something wrong. "I'm not going to take it. I was just looking," she said, almost like a confession, not a defense. Mrs. Mullins didn't respond. She placed her hand on the girl's shoulder, bony but warm and firm. Lily flinched but didn't pull away. She swallowed hard and slowly sat down in the wooden chair next to the table. The air in the kitchen seemed to pause for a moment. The sound of knives, footsteps, and scent stopped suspended in that small moment. Mullins slowly poured milk into a glass, and the sound of it filling was so distinct it made Lily shrink back. The woman placed the glass in front of the girl, without a word, looked at her briefly, then walked away calmly, though her eyes stayed fixed on the far corner of the old table. Lily didn't rush to touch the bread. She stayed silent, her hands on her lap, her eyes fixed on the wood as if deciding something deeply important. After a long pause, her trembling hand reached out not to grab the bread, but to touch the corner of the doily, brushing it softly, as if to check whether this world really was as kind as it seemed. Finally, with a timid gesture, she broke off a piece of the bread, brought it to her mouth, and chewed slowly. Each bite made her blink like she was tasting something completely foreign. She was trying to understand kindness. That night, the wind from the backyard came through the half-open window, bringing with it the scent of damp soil and a faint trace of wild mint. The light from the bedside lamp cast a golden glow over the old wood, and Daniel's shadow stretched across the wall, a figure caught somewhere between the familiar and the distant. Sitting in the chair beside the bed with an open book in his hands, he didn't take his eyes off his daughter, who lay curled up under the blanket facing away from him, her shoulders trembling slightly as if resisting a sleep that still hadn't come. "Do you want me to read the part from yesterday?" Daniel asked in a calm voice. Lily didn't answer. After a moment, a tiny voice rose from the bed like dry leaves brushing together. "If you finish reading, will you leave?" Daniel paused. His hands loosened around the book. He didn't answer right away. In that second, 1,000 replies ran through his mind, but he chose the simplest one. "I'm not going to leave. I'll stay until you fall asleep, and then a little longer." Lily still faced away. The silence wrapped the room as if everyone were listening. A little later, the girl whispered almost like a breath, "I miss my mom." Daniel took a deep breath as if trying to hold back an emotion threatening to spill over. He stood up, took a few steps toward the bed, and dragged the chair closer with a faint scrape. He didn't say anything. He leaned over and gently placed his hand on Lily's tangled hair. That soft hair smelled like warm milk and sweet bread. His palm trembled not from the cold, but from the sorrow tightening in his chest that couldn't be shaped into words. He didn't know what to say. But maybe that silent presence was exactly the answer Lily needed, because sometimes children don't need grand gestures, just an adult who stays and doesn't walk away. Across the hallway, Richard stood against the wall near the stairs holding a worn gray folder in his hand. He had heard everything. The words didn't surprise him, but in his eyes there was something that wasn't entirely contempt. He opened the folder, flipped through a few pages, and stopped at one titled, "Postpartum Psychological Status." Below it, a note written in firm handwriting read, "Unstable with signs of mild paranoia." He closed the folder and let a barely visible smile slip onto his face. Without knocking, Richard turned around and walked away, leaving behind the warm light of the room where a father and daughter were starting to rebuild a small patch of trust. Some children don't know they're loved, not because they aren't, but because they've learned that affection almost always comes with punishment. Tenderness, when it comes too late, is often mistaken for a trap. But if the seed of trust ever begins to grow, no matter how small, it can change everything. Daniel stayed there, his hand resting on his daughter's shoulder. The wind drifted in through the window, carrying the scent of herbs from the backyard garden. Nothing else could be heard except Lily's calm breathing, finally lost in an undisturbed sleep. and in the heart of that man who had learned to live among gunfire, there remained only one cause left to fight for, to preserve his daughter's childhood, even if only the smallest fragments remained. On the old rocking chair near the western corridor of the estate, Mr. Raymond Ellis sat in silence, looking at no one. His gaze fixed on the palm trees whose shadows stretched across the stone fence. The white handkerchief fastened at the collar of his wrinkled shirt fluttered softly whenever the breeze passed through. Sometimes old age doesn't arrive with wrinkles, but with that moment when you no longer feel the need to say anything more. In the next room, Richard Ellis was going over the file one last time. He tapped his fingers to the rhythm of a soft bolero coming from a small speaker by the window. The melody was melancholic, but the calm in Richard's eyes didn't speak of nostalgia. It was the silent satisfaction of someone stepping into a battle already convinced they were going to win. The main hall of the estate had been cleaned with care. The tablecloth in the center was new. The chairs were perfectly aligned, and the flower pots with artificial orchids gleamed as if prepared for a solemn ceremony. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew this wasn't just a simple meeting. Mr. Raymond was the last to enter. He looked slowly at each person in the room with a gaze that wasn't exactly alert, but certainly heavy with shadow. In front of him sat Richard, a psychologist from the capital, and the two board members of the Luz Verdadera Land Trust, Mr. Frank Millman and Miss Letitia Conrad, who had always silently nodded along with the patriarch's decisions. "Before we begin," Richard said in an even tone, "I hope you don't think I'm doing this out of personal interest." Mr. Raymond said nothing. He sat down and crossed his hands over his cane like someone listening to an unspoken accusation. Richard placed a thick file on the table. This document includes an excerpt from the medical history of the girl's mother. The woman showed signs of postpartum emotional disorder and was advised to undergo specialized treatment, but she refused. The psychologist nodded. "According to the clinical notes and the girl's current behavior, we can't rule out a genetic component. Reactions like talking to herself, being startled at night, or avoiding eye contact could be early indicators of a dissociative disorder or mild hallucinations." Mr. Frank looked at Mr. Raymond, then leaned toward Richard. "Is there official confirmation from the hospital? It's an excerpt from the file and the hospital can't deny it because it belongs to the archived records." Richard smiled slightly and turned back to Mr. Raymond. "I wouldn't want a risk like that to remain in a place with elderly residents and children. I believe it would be best to reconsider your decision." A full minute passed without anyone speaking. "You said risk," Mr. Raymond asked in a calm but firm voice. "Is the risk a 6-year-old girl or the adults who want to discard her like a stain on a clean white shirt?" Richard raised his eyebrows slightly. "With all due respect, I don't believe that comparison is appropriate in a scientific context." Mr. Raymond turned to Daniel Alvarez, who had remained silent the entire time. "Did you know about this before?" Daniel took a deep breath as if searching through locked drawers in his memory. "All I know is that the girl was locked out in the yard on a cold night because she knocked on the door 3 times and no one opened it. I know Lily is afraid of the dark, but she always finds a corner with a bit of light to sit in. I don't know what part of that makes her unable to perceive reality." Mr. Frank rubbed his chin. "If we go by emotion alone, it's hard to contradict a medical conclusion." The room fell silent until a woman's voice spoke from the corner. "And what about my grandfather? He yelled at me that I was possessed when I cried for 4 days straight after my mother died." Everyone turned around. Mrs. Carmen Valverde stepped in from the side door, still holding a flour-stained kitchen towel in her hand. "Did anyone consider him a danger to the community then? Did anyone ask for a psychological evaluation based on his grief?" Miss Letitia frowned. "You're changing the subject." "No, I'm getting straight to the point." Carmen placed the towel on the table. "That 6-year-old girl has never yelled, never gotten angry, never hurt anyone. She's just scared, and she curls up in a corner hoping to see someone who doesn't frown when they look at her." The room grew tense. Richard tried to speak, but Mr. Raymond raised his hand. "Carmen, go back to the kitchen," he said softly, but his tone wasn't the same anymore. When the door closed behind her, Mr. Raymond looked up at everyone. "I'll need time to reconsider everything. For now, I ask that Daniel and his daughter leave the estate. In the meantime, I'll review all the information carefully, including the documents Richard presented." Richard tried to reply, but Mr. Raymond raised his hand again. "This is a personal decision. I don't need a vote." Daniel didn't say a word. He just looked at Mr. Raymond for a long moment, as if searching for something in a gaze that now seemed much older. Lily hadn't been present at that meeting. She was on the porch, drawing on the tiles with a dry stick. When Daniel came out, she barely looked up. "What are you drawing?" "The place where we're going to live if Mr. Raymond doesn't want us here anymore." Lily didn't cry. Her voice was soft like the whisper of wind. "I'm drawing it now in case I get lost later." Daniel knelt down and squeezed her shoulder firmly. "No one can draw a path in the dark, but if you walk toward the light, I'll be right behind you." Inside, Mr. Raymond remained still. He didn't look at them, but when Richard picked up his papers, Mr. Raymond asked quietly, "How did you get those documents so quickly?" Richard paused for a moment. The silence stretched, and outside, Lily silently erased the lines she had drawn on the ground as if trying to keep something just for herself. The tamale vendor's call echoed from the corner like a familiar sound that awakened the old neighborhood. No one answered out loud, but there was something in that melody that made the morning feel less empty. On the wooden table near the window, tiny specks of dust swirled in the beam of light and vanished as if they had never been there. Miss Letitia placed the kitchen rag on the table, still holding the scissors in her left hand, her eyes fixed on the wooden staircase that led to the attic behind the house. Ever since Daniel and Lily had moved in, that place seemed to have gained a different heartbeat, uncertain but alive. She never said it out loud, but she felt that there was something weighed down inside the girl's heart, and it crept into her dreams, into her voice, into the quiet way she walked as if she wished not to be noticed. Daniel entered the kitchen with a small bag of sweetbread he had just bought from the corner store. He placed it gently on the table and nodded in greeting. Miss Letitia looked at him with slight concern in her eyes. "Has the girl not come out yet?" she asked softly. "I haven't heard a single sound since dawn. Maybe she's still curled up in her usual corner." Daniel didn't answer. He walked toward the staircase, placing one hand on the railing as if he needed a moment to gather courage before facing the silence upstairs. The attic still held the scent of old wood mixed with faint humidity. Lily was curled up in a corner near a small window where the light barely brushed across part of her face. Her long hair, once her mother Lucia's pride, lay scattered across the floor. The old scissors were still beside her, bent out of shape, and the girl remained silent like a shadow. "I don't want to look like Mom anymore," she said without turning around. "Grandma hated her because she was weak. She said she left behind a useless child. If I look like her, then I must be useless too." Daniel was speechless. He hadn't imagined those cruel words had etched themselves so deeply into a child's memory. "You're not your mother, and your grandmother doesn't get to decide who you are," he said, his voice low but firm. Lily looked at him, her eyes filled with confusion. "Then, if I'm not as good as Mom are, you're going to be disappointed in me. I don't want you to be like anyone. I just want you to speak without fear every time you open your mouth." For the first time since they had left the Luz Verdadera Foundation, Lily began to cry. It wasn't a loud or desperate cry, just silent tears slipping down her pale cheeks. Daniel moved closer, leaned down and pressed his daughter's head gently to his chest. His shoulders trembled not from weakness, but from the deep pain of a father who realized how much weight a little girl had been carrying, a girl who had only just begun to learn how to read. Miss Letitia watched from the bottom of the stairs. She didn't intervene. She simply stood in silence. After a moment, she approached and held out a fabric-covered notebook to Daniel. "Lucia gave me this before Lily was born. She told me that if something ever happened to her, to give it to you. I've kept it for 7 years. Now it's time it returned to where it belongs." Daniel took it. He didn't open it right away. He stared at the cover for a while. The faded ink showed a handwritten message, "Lily, my daughter. If one day you ever read this." He opened the first page. The words emerged like a whisper from deep in the past. "Daniel, if I'm no longer with you and our daughter, please don't let Lily grow up feeling like a mistake. She is the most beautiful gift life ever gave me." Miss Letitia walked away without saying another word, leaving father and daughter wrapped in a silence full of meaning. On the paper, Lucia's words illuminated the soul of the reader with a warm and steady light. As the afternoon began casting shadows over the old streets, Daniel entered Miss Antonia's grocery store with slow steps. The smell of roasted beans lingered in the air, mixed with the soft clinking of a spoon against a glass jar. Miss Antonia was arranging bags of seeds when her hand paused at the sight of a familiar silhouette. She didn't need to look up. Her eyes were already fixed on the fabric-covered notebook Daniel held close, as if it contained the remains of someone he had loved. "I think you'll know who this belongs to," Daniel said, placing it on the counter. Miss Antonia picked it up, flipped through a few pages, and then stopped. Her expression grew deep. "There are words that, even if they come late, are still better than never being spoken at all. I don't need anyone to feel sorry for Lily. I just want people to understand that she isn't some shadow from a broken past. Lily was never a shadow, Daniel. Sometimes adults just pretend to be blind." By the time Daniel returned, the sky had already turned golden. Lily was sitting by the window with a broken porcelain doll pressed to one ear, the only thing she had brought from her grandmother's house. Rodrigo sat beside her, his gaze gentle. "Do you want me to read your mom's journal?" Camila nodded slightly. Rodrigo opened the notebook and began to read. His voice didn't break, but each word seemed to carve itself into both their hearts with permanent ink. Outside, the leaves were falling one by one onto the tile roof. Miss Letitia's house wasn't luxurious or quiet, but it was the first place where Camila felt like she could exist without shrinking. And when night fell, Rodrigo whispered beside her bed, "Tomorrow, I think we'll go see Mr. Ernest. Not to beg, but to bring truth back to what was buried for so long." Camila didn't answer, but she gripped her father's hand tightly as if saying with her whole being, "I'm with you. There are adults who make children feel invisible, but there are also those who, with just one hug and a few words at the right time, can return the light others tried to extinguish." The sound of a long-distance bus horn echoed from the end of the red dirt road, blending with the noise of a street market just beginning to stir. The scent of fresh lime from recently painted walls mingled with the smell of ripe fruit, leaving a trace of nostalgia in the air. Mr. Ernest Gutierrez stood a few steps away from the makeshift medical booth, his hands in his pockets, his eyes fixed on the white canvas that bore a hand-stitched message, "Health Campaign, Hope for Everyone." He had arrived early without telling anyone. There was no need for names or introductions. He only needed a moment to see the little girl he hadn't protected when she needed him most. Some part of his conscience, or maybe a quiet corner of his heart hardened by years of silence, pushed him to take that step. Before getting out of the vehicle, he sat there for a long while, not out of doubt, but out of fear of touching a wound that Camila and Rodrigo had tried so hard to cover. Was his presence now an act of redemption, or just another shadow that might disturb their peace? But it was the image of the teddy bear with the torn ear resting silently on a chair in the hall that gave him his answer. It wasn't just a toy. It was proof of a silent weight, something that had never been discarded, only set aside for a while. A young nurse passed by him and stopped when she recognized him. She whispered something to her coworker inside the tent and disappeared behind a plastic curtain. Mr. Ernest didn't rush. He stood tall like in his days as a commander, but his gaze no longer gave orders. It asked for a chance. There was only sadness and a quiet urgency. When Camila appeared, she was holding tightly to the sleeve of an older woman, likely a volunteer. Her hair was carefully pulled back, and she wore an old floral dress, clean but faded. She didn't look up right away. She walked slowly, cautiously, and then, as if something nudged her, she stopped and raised her eyes. They were less than 10 feet apart. But the way Camila's eyes landed on Mr. Ernest made him feel like he had just crossed a desert. "Uncle Ernest, I learned how to write the letter G." Her voice wasn't loud or sure, but it was enough for a few people nearby to turn their heads. Mr. Ernest stood still for a moment, then took a few steps toward her slowly, as if afraid of breaking something fragile. He knelt in front of Camila and placed his hand gently on her shoulder. "Forgive me. I shouldn't have left when you needed me most." Camila didn't answer, but for the first time her eyes didn't shy away from his, and that said everything. The sound of hurried footsteps interrupted them. Leandro Escobedo appeared impeccable as always, with a cold expression on his face. His gaze swept over Camilla as if she were a stain that needed to be erased. He raised his voice theatrically. Another emotional show for those who like living in fantasy. So what are we going to do with a girl who lives in an imaginary world? Make her a symbol of redemption, uncle. The murmur around them quieted. A nearby flower vendor shook her head. The girl hasn't done anything wrong to deserve being treated like that, she said. Mr. Ernest stood up. Without looking at Leandro, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick bundle of documents. I trusted you, but after reading the hospital reports with my own eyes, I understood that what you did is unforgivable. You manipulated information, exaggerated medical records, made up diagnoses to isolate a little girl, all just to keep control of these lands. Leandro stood frozen for a moment. His eyes flashed with a defensive spark. I only made the right decision. Do you really think an unemployed man and a girl who lives in fantasies can represent the legacy of Luz Verdadera? You're letting your emotions cloud your judgment. An older man in the crowd spoke clearly. That's why you don't understand anything, kid. A girl who knows how to wait for someone to come back even after being abandoned. That girl deserves a chance. A few timid claps rose from the people near the medical tent. Miss Carmen Valverde, the old housekeeper from the estate, stepped out from the crowd. She didn't say a single word to Leandro. He walked over to Camilla and placed a hand on her shoulder. Shall we make flan like last time, sweetheart? This time we'll add a little vanilla. Camilla nodded. Her eyes were still wet, but the corner of her lips began to form a slight curve. Mr. Ernest turned to look at Leandro, and for the first time his gaze was firm. You don't have to leave town, but from now on, you have no rights over these lands or over the True Light Foundation. If you have a shred of decency left, walk away before the authorities get involved. Leandro didn't reply. His eyes drifted for a moment, then he turned and quickly walked toward the black car parked under the shade of a tree. Camilla took Mr. Ernest's hand. She spoke almost in a whisper. Uncle, could you read me that story again? I want to know if the princess ever made it to the rose garden. Mr. Ernest leaned down and gently stroked her head. And what princess hasn't gotten lost before, sweetheart? But if there's someone waiting at the end of that garden, that little girl will find her way back. A soft breeze lifted one corner of the white canvas above them, casting a warm light across Camilla's face, like the breath of a new morning. Mr. Ernest watched her quietly, understanding a truth that needed no words. Some wounds don't bleed, but with someone willing to stay, they heal on their own. And he finally understood that family isn't measured by last names, but by who chooses to stay when they're needed most. A sparrow with a broken wing rested in the palm of Camilla's hand. She wasn't crying. She simply stared at it for a long time, then whispered something no one could hear. She took an old handkerchief, gently rolled it up, and placed the little bird inside as if cradling a sleeping baby. Miss Carmen Valverde watched from a corner of the hallway, blinking slowly. She didn't say a word. Some adults talk too much when they feel pity, but Carmen had learned something in all her years as a housekeeper. Sometimes what someone needs most is for another person to stay without speaking and without leaving. From the steps that led down to the garden, Mr. Ernest Gutierrez's footsteps echoed in a steady rhythm. He stopped behind the girl, watching her closely. He didn't need to ask. He knew that today the only thing she needed was to believe that there was still a place in this world where tenderness hadn't vanished despite all she'd lived through. Mr. Ernest wasn't a man of fancy words. Over the course of his life, he had saved a few people and lost far more than he cared to count. But standing in front of Camilla in that moment, he realized that being kind wasn't enough. He had to be someone willing to take responsibility. And that's why a few hours earlier, he had walked into the boardroom of the True Light Foundation with a decision that couldn't be undone. The inheritance, he told the board, cannot belong to someone willing to twist the truth to protect personal interests. No document signed in the name of family honor should allow cruelty. When he finished speaking, no one in the room dared to raise their eyes. Leandro Escobedo wasn't there. He had already left, suitcase in hand, and a silent rage burning inside him, but that silence was his harshest punishment. Mr. Ernest didn't look back. He walked straight to the administrative office, where he signed the documents that would transfer the community fund benefits, ensuring Camila would be treated at the best hospital in the region. The diagnosis was clear. The girl suffered from no mental illness. All her wounds were emotional scars, the result of years of isolation threats and the absence of affection. That same afternoon, Miss Carmen walked with Camila through the garden. Their hands brushed against the blooming lavender stems. The scent of calm spread like a whisper the earth wanted to share. Camila looked up at Carmen, no longer with the mistrust she had shown on her first day. In a timid voice, she asked, "Do you like watering the plants?" Carmen smiled and shook her head, never taking her eyes off the flowers. "I prefer baking cakes, but if you water the plants every morning, I'll bake the cakes. Sound fair?" Camila nodded with a small smile. It wasn't exactly a happy smile, but it was a real one. A gentle breeze brushed past her. The girl still held the sparrow wrapped in her handkerchief, as if letting go might break something very fragile. Mr. Ernest watched from a distance. He didn't approach. He didn't need to. From the moment he signed the letter of acceptance that recognized Camila and Rodrigo Alvarez as members of the True Light Foundation, he was already part of that family. In the west hallway, Rodrigo had just folded the last piece of hand-washed clothing. He still kept his old habit, everything arranged in neat, precise rows. Carmen walked past him, looked at him, and gave a slight nod. They didn't talk much, but in their eyes there was a mutual respect that grew stronger every day. "She talked more today," Carmen said softly. Rodrigo looked up. "What did she say?" "She just asked if the smell of the almond cakes I usually bake was anything like her mom's." She fell silent for a long moment. Then she added slowly, "She never had one made by her mother." And then, almost as if to herself, "But if she remembers a scent, then it must have been a kind one." Carmen nodded and went on her way. That night, Camila sat on a little chair by the window. Mr. Ernest's old book was already open. Rodrigo walked in, drying his hands with a rag. He saw his daughter frowning as if trying to decipher a tricky sentence. "Where did you leave off?" he asked. "At the part where the old man in the forest teaches the fox how to write the letter Q," Camila replied without looking up. Rodrigo sat down beside her. He read slowly, line by line. Camila didn't interrupt. When he reached the part where the fox gets lost in the rain, the girl asked in a quiet voice, "Have you ever been lost, Dad?" Rodrigo answered without hesitation. "Yes, many times, but I always found my way by thinking about you." This time, Camila stayed silent for a long while. Then she closed the book, tilted her head, and gently rested it on her father's shoulder. "I got lost once too, just once, but I already found my dad." Out in the yard, Miss Carmen was placing trays into the oven. The smell of freshly ground almonds was beginning to fill the big house. In a corner of the garden, the sparrow still rested inside a small box lined with soft fabric. It still couldn't fly, but it was breathing. And somewhere deep inside, Camila, she knew that maybe that was enough. Mr. Ernest stood under the corridor, his hands clasped behind his back. He wasn't looking at anyone, and he didn't need to be seen. Under the soft light of the old lantern, he murmured to himself in a low voice, "A family doesn't need to share blood. It just needs to never let go." One morning, when a gentle mist covered the red rooftops of the True Light Hacienda, Camila carefully pushed open the wooden door and stepped into the garden just like she did every day. Her small woolen sandals touched the cool earth, leaving tiny footprints on the gravel path. She no longer carried the look of fear she once had, but instead a calm and steady gaze, the kind of gaze only children have when they've walked through darkness and chosen to remain in the light. It's been 2 years since the day Mr. Ernest declared that Camila was part of his family. Since then, everything has changed little by little. Not through grand decisions, but through consistency in the little things. A question asked at just the right time, a hug for no reason, an afternoon baking bread without needing to be an expert. Rodrigo now manages the new stable at the hacienda. He no longer wears his military watch or walks with the guarded steps of someone always on alert. Instead, every morning, he brews mint tea, sets it next to a book on the wooden table, and waits for Camila to sit with him and read. The girl no longer calls him Sir, but Dad, with a natural ease so genuine, it's as if there had never been any separation at all. Miss Carmen still lives there. She never married and she never moved away. She stayed not because she had no other options, but because she understood that this was where she belonged. Every morning she teaches Camilla how to make bread. The girl now knows how to mix the dough without spilling flour everywhere, and every time the bread is done she asks, "Should I take half to Mr. Ernest?" He's not a big fan of sweet stuff, remember? Mr. Ernest is weaker now, but he still reads the newspaper every afternoon on the porch. Once, while watching Camilla, he told Rodrigo, "That girl taught me how to ask for forgiveness without saying a single word." Leandro, after the internal hearing and the multiple complaints of misconduct, left town. Rumor has it he moved to Merida, where he opened a small bar and lives quietly. No one talks much about him, nor do they continue to condemn him. Because in the hearts of the elderly, forgiving is also a way of closing the book instead of staying trapped in bitterness. As for Miss Margaret, after receiving psychological treatment, she was transferred to a nursing home. Camilla never asks about her, but once she said to Carmen, "If someone says they're sorry without using words, does it still count?" Carmen hugged her gently and whispered, "If that person changes the way they live, then every day they do better is a way of saying, 'I'm sorry.'" Camilla grew up surrounded by compassion. She learned how to care for the plants, to recite poems to the horses, and to fall asleep without needing to keep one eye open. She writes in a journal every night, not to hide anything but to remember every small thing she's grateful for. And one day in the room that years before had been the setting for Leandro's hearing, Mr. Ernest stood up to read his new will. His voice was weak but clear. "My estate will be divided between two people. One is Rodrigo Alvarez, who taught me that you haven't lost everything as long as you still have kindness. And the other is Camila Alvarez, who made me believe that a little girl who was thrown out into the street can also learn to open the door for others." After the ceremony, Camilla walked up to Mr. Ernest, took his hand and said, "I don't need anything more than this place, but if you want me to, I'll keep my promise. I'll take care of this garden." Mr. Ernest smiled, gave her hand a gentle pat, and replied, "The only thing I need is to wake up every morning and hear your laughter coming from the kitchen. That's all." There are stories that don't need medals or grand gestures, just a hug at the right time, a gaze that doesn't look away in the face of injustice, to make the whole world pause and reflect. Rodrigo didn't point fingers or seek revenge in anger, but it was precisely that calm, that quiet protection of his daughter that awakened the hearts of those around him. Today's story reminds us that wrongdoers might hide their guilt for a while, but the light of justice will always find a way in. Good people may be hurt, overlooked, but in the end they will receive what they truly deserve. Family doesn't always come from blood. Sometimes all it takes is someone who stays, who listens, who protects and loves, and that's enough to make a home. And you, have you ever seen a father, a mother, or even a stranger stand up with courage for someone they love? Do you believe that even if the world outside is cold, as long as there's a place to return to, it's still possible to begin again? If this story touched your heart, leave a comment and tell me what you think. I read each of your messages with care and gratitude. I wish you a day full of peace, and don't forget, always be kind to the fragile children who cross your path.